with the group. And thanks to all of you for joining this evening. I'm going to share the screen here. There we go. And I hope that's working for everyone to be able to see the screen.
It looks good.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to reduce my my Zoom window. It's amazing how there was a time just a year or two ago when we were all experts in manipulating this software, and now it's starting to fade, which is good. And Stefan, is my volume okay right now? Are you
Your
hearing me?
volume is good for me. Everybody, please look at your volume. If it's a little bit low, adjust your speakers up, but it's coming through okay. So you should be able to get good sound as long as you're adjusted well at your end.
Terrific. Okay, well, thanks again. I'm going to talk about climate and forest fires. And while the title is a bit gloomy, because I think it's true that our forest fires are moving to unsustainable levels, and the picture here is a threatening, menacing picture from a fire in 2011 in northern New Mexico, Las Conchas. I do want to say that there are positive elements of opportunities for interventions to help change the trajectory of forest fires to some degree. And I'll talk about that as well. So just to start off with, the climate is getting warmer. This is a graphic that comes from climatecentral.org, which is a useful source for information and these kind of infographics on different aspects of climate change. And I show this often to audiences or classes and have them note when they start looking at the years that almost always the 10 hottest global years are the last 10 years, and that keeps on holding true. You might also see how what a big jump last year was, 2023, how far above the other 9 hottest global years that year was for the world. These warm conditions translate in many parts of the world pretty directly into forest fire conditions that lead to warmer, drier fuels that catch fire more easily, are more resistant to control. This is a relatively new graphic, this idea of a climate shift index. And what this is showing is not only climate getting warmer, or in some cases, pretty much not anywhere that I could see in the Americas, but in a few places in the world, a little bit cooler. And then the color scale here is not a color ramp of temperature. It's actually the likelihood that this temperature condition is due to climate change. And you can see that Arizona and the Southwest, northern Mexico into Central California, the region that's highlighted, has a very high likelihood that our current situation, our current temperature regime, is due to climate change. The characteristics of warming basically affect fire in several different ways. Each year, the fire season gets longer. So earlier in the spring, we have fuels that are drying out. Even back in the winter, we may have more precipitation coming as snow instead of rain. Excuse me, rain instead of snow, and therefore not sticking around to form a snowpack that would melt and release the water more slowly. Fuels dry earlier in the spring. They reach drier conditions during the summer, the fire season in most of the country, and they often stay dry longer into the fall. And so these two graphs are showing, these two images are showing you that in a couple of different ways. The top image is showing the length of the fire season increasing. the bottom image is showing geographically where most of this increase is concentrated. And you see that it is largely in the Western US. Although there's definitely substantial changes in parts of the Eastern US as well. And the fire regimes in the East have been affected by a warming climate also. So let's bring this a little bit closer to home. Here are about 65 or 70 years of weather records from the weather station in Flagstaff, which is at the airport. And we can see a huge amount of variability from year to year, an average right around 20 inches. And the little red line, the dotted line in the center is kind of fit through these data. It's pretty flat. There's not really too much change. For some of you who may live in this region, this may seem surprising. However, if we look at temperature, here we start to see a definite directional shift. And in this period of about 6 or 7 decades, which is a very short time, a very fast moment, if you think in terms of geological time and ecological time, we are seeing a shift that is approaching an average of 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Furthermore, the red line in here is fit through the entire data set that's shown on the screen. But if you look at the first half until about 1980, it's actually pretty flat. And the rise in temperature really starts happening after that. And here locally, our average temperature has actually increased by somewhat more than the average US increase over the last few decades. Within about 65 or so years, we are comparable to what the whole United States has achieved in about 120 years. So the West is one of the regions of the US where warming is occurring more quickly. The far north, of course, Canada, Alaska, Siberia, Scandinavia, those are the places, taking the Earth as a whole, that have warmed the most. So when we look at these sorts of changes, it is not, in the case of Flagstaff and true of much of the Western US, it's not so much that precipitation has failed. There have been some significant drought periods, but on average, our precipitation has continued to more or less hold up. But when it gets steadily warmer, that means that there's more evaporation and fuels can become drier at any given time during the fire season. So I've been trying to hide the meeting controls. I'm not sure if that shows up on other people's screens. I'm trying to keep the screens a little bit more clear. But let's take a look at where the future may take us. So we've already seen a substantial increase in temperature. That's only what's happened so far. That only brings us up to the present. When we look ahead for the rest of this century, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which is the global organization bringing together climate scientists and climate specialists from all around the world, from all countries, has developed a number of different scenarios of what the future might look like. And there are a couple of scenarios here in red on the right-hand side of the screen. So under a very favorable scenario, the increase in temperature for the rest of the century might be as low as another 2.5 degrees. Under a more keep things going as they are type of scenario, we're looking at more than 8 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century. So Flagstaff, Arizona at the top, which is where Stefan and I live, we are at an elevation of 7,000 feet, and historically, in the past 5 decades or so, our mean annual temperature has been about 46 degrees. A change of 2.4 degrees would give us a mean annual temperature equivalent to that of Gallup, New Mexico, about 500 feet lower than Flagstaff. And if you look at the photographs, that's kind of what's starting to get at the point that I'm trying to make here. Flagstaff is surrounded by a sea of forest. Gallup has some trees you can see, especially on some of the higher mesas in the foreground of this picture, but it is not surrounded by forest. And the main mechanism of transition, if Flagstaff's environment and climate were to become similar to that of Gallup, would probably be through a series of large fires. And then when we look at the more severe and probably more likely climate change of over 8 degrees, that makes us similar. That would change our climate to be similar to that of Prescott, Arizona. That's dropping 1,600 feet in elevation and a mean annual temperature that's substantially higher. And Prescott is surrounded by grasslands and shrublands for the most part, rather than forests. So this is just a thought exercise to try to visualize ways in which future climates may look like examples. The place where we live now may look like examples of other places that are warmer if we think about what the meaning is of these future scenarios. And this is something you can do yourself wherever you live. You can consider, what might my environment be like if um, either from the lower or the higher set of scenarios were to come to pass in the coming decades. Here in Flagstaff, we have seen substantial changes in our local environment due to a number of large fires, really beginning in the late 1990s, so about 30 years ago, and coming right on up to the present. So Flagstaff is next to the San Francisco Peaks, the highest mountains in Arizona, sacred to all indigenous groups of this region, extremely important for all of us as places, that's where our water comes from, places for wildlife, places for recreation and solitude. The museum fire here is one example of a fire burning right next to Flagstaff in 2019. Here's a scene from the pipeline fire on the San Francisco Peaks in 2022. The headline that you see there on the report matches the headlines that I think everybody's familiar with from many places around the country and around the world, of massive evacuations, of fires burning into communities, and so on. For us in Flagstaff, despite having had several very large, severe wildfires in the past quarter century, we have had we've been spared losing people's lives or having houses burn. But one of the major changes that we have dealt with is flooding. And what you see in this picture is flood following the pipeline fire that we just took a look at. And that's the front edge, that black, tarry looking line running in that arroyo there is the front edge of a flood coming off the mountain in a storm that followed the fire. And you can see that in this particular case, the area in the foreground was burned kind of at a mixed severity sort of fire. Many trees were killed, many trees were surviving. You can see lots of grass growth and so on. But back behind this in the watershed, where the slopes are steeper, where the fire burned more intensely, the trees were completely killed. The forest litter covering the ground was burned. And so when heavy rains come and hit those unprotected soils, that's where you get a massive amount of runoff. Oops. This is a paper that came out 5 years ago by Singleton et al., colleagues here at Northern Arizona University. And they looked at trends, as the title says, in southwestern fires and fire severity going back for the entire period of time that we have satellite data. So some of the first satellites for Earth observation were launched in the 1970s. From about the mid 1980s, we start to have pretty high resolution satellite data. And the data in this case come from Landsat satellites that many of you may be familiar with. They have pixels that are 30 meters in size, so it's a pretty fine scaled representation of vegetation on Earth. Um, Through a technique looking at the difference between pre-fire and post-fire satellite images, you can calculate the size of a fire's footprint, and you can estimate pretty accurately the severity of the fire. And the severity means the effects that it had on vegetation, soil, wildlife habitat, etc. It basically, when we are talking about the category called high severity, that means that pretty much all of the vegetation has been killed above the surface of the ground, and also that the surface was burned severely, so that impacts like the erosion we just talked about were evident. So what we see in these graphs is increases. So in part A at the top, we see the number of fires going up over the decades from the 80s into the 20 teens. We also see burned area going up. That's in the panels B and C here. And these graphs have exponential scales. It's the logarithm of the area rather than the area itself. So it looks sort of like they're going up kind of gently. Actually, they're going up very dramatically. And the reason for taking the log in these graphs is that the increases have been so large that it becomes difficult to try to make everything fit on a graphical axis so you can see it. So in red, I've put the corresponding amount of where some of these graphs are topping off. Burned area in graph B is averaging 400,000 acres per year in Arizona and New Mexico. 54,000 acres of that is in forests and woodlands in high severity fires. So these are numbers that add up when they're occurring annually. There's only something on the order of, including forests and woodlands, somewhere around 11 million acres in the two states of forests and woodlands. So if it is burning at a rate of several 100,000 acres per year on average, and over 50,000 acres per year on average of high severity fire, that reflects a pretty substantial transformation of these forest types. So this is a resource that kind of gives us an overall picture of the situation. I want to pause for a second to stress that this is not exclusively due to climate. It is also due to the legacy of over 100 years of keeping natural fires out of our forests. It's due to a legacy of management actions such as logging that removed big old trees and facilitated regeneration of dense young trees. These actions were not done necessarily with a bad intent, and they were not done with a full understanding of the consequences. But as we have increasingly come to understand the consequences, we need to be thinking about alternatives to this sort of management. I wanted to show real quick these two websites. These are places with publicly available resources that might be of interest to some of you. The National Interagency Fire Center, or NIFC, has statistics on things like the number of fires all around the nation, broken into different regions, the costs, the crew members being sent to these fires, and so forth. And the website called InsaWeb, INSA refers to incidents. So a fire burning somewhere, all those dots that you see on the map, those are considered incidents. occasions of fire burning right now. You can click on them and gain more information about them. So if you find yourself being interested in this topic, you want to learn more about maybe the place where you are, then these can be useful. So I want to back up for a moment and talk about the way that our ecosystems looked prior to this recent human-caused climate change. And just kind of walk you through a little bit of the types of forests and the characteristics of fire regimes in some of these forests that we have in the Southwest. So at the scale of a diagram like this, which is looking at all of North America, when we look into the Southwest, it mostly looks like semi-desert, that kind of pink color with a little bit of green here and there for the Rocky Mountains. But when we zoom in, here we are seeing Arizona and New Mexico as the top two states. And then below them, we have Sonora, Chihuahua, and Texas. We see a great diversity of vegetation types, right? And so this is a type of mapping of plant communities or biotic communities. It was done by David Brown. The book cover is shown in the lower left of this image. And this includes many diverse types of vegetation from desert to mountaintops. The Southwest is characterized by having a high amount of biological diversity because of steep elevational gradients. Our topography is very rugged with mountains and canyons, and so we have elevational changes that correspond to a lot of differences in climate. The type of forests that grow at the very highest elevations are subalpine forests, the ones shaded blue in this picture. Tiny fraction of what we have in the Southwest, less than 1% of our land area. Here you see a picture of the San Francisco Peaks. Anyone from Flagstaff will recognize that as an old picture because the effects of the museum and pipeline fires do not show up in that forest. You can see an aspen forest down below. Here is a pretty remarkable place in Chihuahua. The trees in the picture at the right and the picture at the bottom are spruces. Spruces are normally a very cold subalpine type of tree. This is a relict stand of Chihuahua spruce, Picea chihuahuana, that has survived since the last ice age on the north-facing slopes in the Sierra Madre Occidental, the western Sierra Madre. That tree with 77 sprayed on it, that's because it is tree number 77. These trees are so rare that the foresters have identified every single one in an attempt to try to save it. So much more common for us are these montane forests, Petron and Sierra and montane forests. And again, for those of you familiar with the region of northern Arizona, we have the huge ponderosa pine forest that stretches into New Mexico, and we have many other similar forests scattered around the high mountains or sky islands of our two states. And here are some images of what these forests look like. These are warmer and drier forests than the subalpine forests we mentioned a minute ago. These are subject to drying out and experiencing fire almost any summer. And that's an important point that we're going to come back to in a minute. So you saw Arizona, New Mexico there. Here are scenes from Durango and Chihuahua. Similar areas of trees that are very adapted to a certain kind of fire, to fires that burn on the surface without burning into the canopy. That huge pine tree that you see in the lower right has very thick bark. The plates of bark on that tree might be 2 or 3 inches thick, and they provide extraordinary insulation to the bottom of that tree when fire passes by. So this gentleman here looks like he's working hard, and what he's doing is taking an increment core from a tree He's removing a small tube of wood that looks like a pencil, about the size of a pencil anyway, and carries a sample of all of the tree rings. This is Andrew Douglas, a scientist, an astronomer originally, who established the principles of tree ring dating or dendrochronology. And he began doing that work here in Flagstaff, Arizona. He was surrounded by stumps showing the tree rings of many trees at the time, at the late 1800s, early 1900s, that he was here. And he began to see patterns across from one tree to another. And he thought maybe that would connect to sunspots. It turned out not to connect very well to sunspots, but he developed an entire science of being able to show the exact year of formation of tree rings. And this, for example, can be used to date wood in ancient structures such as past pueblos or buildings or musical instruments or what have you. And then it can be used for many ecological purposes. And one of those ecological purposes is helping us decipher the history of fire left behind in many trees that have been scarred by fires over the years. So in the upper left here, a small sample has been cut in that tree that looks all dry and scarred and damaged and deformed. A piece of sample is being held here in the lower right picture. Using these kinds of approaches, people have been able to reconstruct fire histories over many centuries. So in this graphic on the left here, there's in the middle panel where it says fire, there are horizontal lines. Those are time series of tree rings from fire-scarred trees. And all the little triangles add up to fire years. They're showing on this tree, there was a fire in this year, this year, this year, this year, this year, etc. And you see how they line up and create major fire years in much of that area. In periods that were a little bit wetter, there tended to be a lag, maybe say 15 or 20 years without fire. Much of the rest of the time, there was a fire about every 5 or so years. This was in southern Colorado. Fires stopped kind of abruptly. There's a line right after 1871 when fires cease. That has to do with the introduction of large herds of livestock by Anglo-American settlers who basically broke the continuity of grass fuels by large-scale livestock grazing. And then shortly after that, they began to carry out organized fire suppression and put fires out. And in these bars down at the bottom that say pines and other, we start to see a huge population explosion in the tree population. Trees begin to proliferate because the fires that kept the forest open were no longer present. We can see that on the landscape in the images on the right, a pen and ink drawing in 1870. There's a hill in the center that's very open except for a few pine trees. That same hill, 125 years later, almost completely filled in with trees. So these are examples of some of the studies that have documented the way in which fire regimes have changed. Combining these kinds of fire data across the whole Southwest, this is work by Tom Swetnam and Chris Basin. Tom Swetnam was for many years the director of the Tree Ring Lab at the University of Arizona, which was founded by Andrew Douglas. So we're, scientifically just like a couple generations down the road of trying to understand some of these ecological elements. And what this graph shows is across Arizona, New Mexico, all these peaks that have years, that have dates on them, those are the top 20 fire years across the Southwest. In 1748, basically 2/3 of the forests in the Southwest were on fire. However, those fires were not killing all the vegetation. They were not leading to giant floods and landslides. In fact, the trees that were burned in that fire survived the fire. They were scarred by it, but continued to live for centuries afterwards, which is how we could find those fire scars and date them today. And then you see the great drop off after about 1880, when the occurrence of fire scarring almost disappears on the landscape. So I want to move to really the last part here, which is to show in a little more detail an instance where we can start to look at the impact of indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge that Native Americans have in terms of living with a fire-prone environment, and think about this as a uh, as information that's useful to think about a potential way forward, even as climate continues to warm. This is a scene from the Hualapai tribal lands. The Hualapai Nation is in northwestern Arizona, although the Hualapai people occupied much larger areas prior to Anglo-American settlement. You can see in this inset map showing the state of Arizona, the location of the Hualapai Reservation it's in the western Grand Canyon. And then the satellite image, this is a false color image. So what's red on this image is actually green. That's where the forest is located. And a group of us worked at several different study sites shown here in yellow to try to use these dendrochronological methods to reconstruct patterns of fire in the past. So the Hualapai tribe, the Hualapai people are very connected to the forest. Their name for themselves is the people of the tall pines. And they have managed using fire for a long time. And they also manage the forest with what's called uneven age silviculture. And the most relevant part of that for us is that essentially it means that it's not focused on cutting the largest trees, but rather on maintaining a range of ages in the forest. And that supports wildlife habitat. It's a much more natural approach of forest management. At the top, you can see some scenes from the Hualapai Nation. This comes from the Hualapai website. Here are a few scenes out in the field. The gentleman in the upper left is Melvin Hunter Jr., who years ago was a college student at NAU and currently is the chief forester for the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the Western region. So an example of what happens with our students over their careers. You can see the Grand Canyon off in the distance in the upper right and the forest. And then in the lower right, you see one of the dendrochronological samples in the field as it was cut from an old stump. One of the great benefits of dendrochronology is that we can sample dead wood and thereby extend our histories far into the past and reduce the need to damage living trees. Although I want to emphasize that even when we sample from living trees, we do not kill them. We take a small sample that the tree can survive. So when we put together that kind of a fire chart for the Hualapai forest, and we look at the last 300 years, going back to 1700, we have three different periods. So there's two gray shaded periods and one that's left white. So the gray shaded period on the left, called historical, this shows many fires in the past at all of these different study sites. And you can see how these dark dots that indicate the occurrence of fire, they line up on many years, including the year of 1748 that we talked about earlier and some other key years. But as we get to the late 1800s, after about 1860, we come to the last fire and we enter a long period without any fires. And this period of excluding fires is similar to what we see all across the rest of the Southwest and the rest of the Western United States. I'm saying the US in particular because in northern Mexico, there's quite a different history due to different land use and different policies and so forth. But across almost all of the United States, we see this ending of the frequent fire regime. But what I want to show is starting in 1960, fire began to reappear on this landscape. And it reappeared because the Wallapai tribe and the tribal government and the foresters decided to reintroduce fire. They carried out prescribed burns in the forest. They also had some wildfires that burned through the forest without necessarily killing a lot of trees. The scarring left behind by these fires gives us a fire history that begins to be similar to what existed prior to the fire exclusion period. So we might ask the question, does this return of fire for what is now 65 years since 1964 years since 1960, does it help forests adapt to climate change? Well, in some ways, it clearly does. If you look at this area, was one of the study areas, you see there's not a lot of wood on the forest floor. You can see that some trees are grouped together, but other trees are kind of spaced apart. Um, it certainly can burn in a severe fire, but it is far from the most severe example of fuels on our landscape. And in a follow-up study, we compared the forest structure at Wallapai to the forest structure across the state of Arizona for ponderosa pine trees. So foresters make a lot of graphs like this. They're showing how many trees there are per hectare or per acre on the y-axis, and then how big those trees are on the x-axis. And the point of interest here, I'm sorry, there's some background noise behind me that I can't.
Sorry about that.
No worries. The light green colors here are the whole state of Arizona. This comes from the U.S. National Forest Inventory. And what you see is that these light colored green bars, as the trees get smaller and smaller, there are more and more and more little trees. Having many, many, many little trees in the forest make ladders of fuel that the fire can climb into the canopy. When we look at the Wallapai lands, the dark green bars, we see that the big trees are pretty similar, but when we get to the small trees, there are much fewer of them. It's the difference between these two shades of green in the small trees that show that the Wallapai forest is in fact much safer from severe burning than the average forest in Arizona. And we think this is related to the forest management, including the use of fire for many decades. So this idea of restoring this important process of natural fire really helps with the unnatural, anthropogenic, human-caused climate change that is imposing itself on our ecosystems. And that's what I meant at the beginning by saying that there are some elements that are not totally negative. It's nice to be able to say that, at least to some extent, in a presentation on climate change. So steps forward in our region. Obviously, it is beneficial at all levels to try to reduce the impacts of climate change itself. So I think that all of you who have an interest in this topic and have chosen to attend these kind of talks are aware of global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to move to renewable sources of energy, and so on. And at the global scale, this may help us avoid the most extreme negative warming scenarios, like the examples we looked at earlier, and perhaps keep us into a moderate, relatively more moderate warming scenario. But even those moderate warming scenarios are absolutely going to stress all of our ecosystems and social systems worldwide. And starting in a place that is already very dry, like the southwestern US, it's likely that we are going to have a lot of challenges ahead of us. So some of the actions that we can take on the ground to try to intervene include carrying out prescribed fires like the picture shown on the left. Prescribed burning is widely done in the Southwest, but it's not done anywhere near the pace that would be needed to try to stay ahead of what we saw as a steady increase in fire fires in general and severe fires in particular. And then the picture with the third graders um, is really getting at the idea of communicating these issues to future generations. And of course, we try to do that through the university, through community events, um, and through reaching out to younger kids. So with that, I'm going to stop the share and open it up, Stefan, if that's okay, and if we have time, to any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fulé. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences and your research and some of the long-term implications for our forests. I'm hoping that people have lots of questions for you. I've got a few if people don't. Jan Budart from NEIS just put in a question. If you would like, you could verbalize that question now, since we'll open it up. People can unmute and
Uh,
please add your question.
My question, it's not a question and it's off the topic. I just put it in case people are interested. I'm an anti-nuclear activist, but I did live in Arizona for a long time when I was young. And I also majored in botany. So I'm just really interested in this subject. But my announcement is just for general people. And I don't know what's wrong with my video, but never mind. It doesn't matter.
Sorry, we don't get to see you, but yeah. So you are expressing concern about nuclear energy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But that's what I do full time. So
Yeah. Yeah, it has a lot of its own sets of issues, including the effect on our native communities. And I shouldn't really be answering the question so much as Dr. Fulé.
Right. Well, that one, as Jan said, is not exactly a question, more of an announcement. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Other questions? Well, I've got one for you. So over this last year, I think right at the turn of the year, December, January, the NAU Economic Policy Institute put out a report saying that catastrophic wildfire in Flagstaff or around Flagstaff could cause as much as $2.8 billion worth of damage. And that's pretty eye-opening to me. I don't know. I'd love to get your response to their report and their conclusions.
I am familiar with that report, and it makes sense to me. And for those of you who are from this area or familiar with it, you may know that the fires that I showed pictures of, like the pipeline fire, the tunnel fire, the museum fire, they led to flooding, as we talked about, and that flooding has been very damaging in many communities or parts of our community. But those fires have all occurred in watersheds that do not drain directly into the main urban center of Flagstaff. And so the economic group that Stefan mentioned analyzed the effects of fire in the Rio de Flag watershed. So I'm sitting on the campus of NAU. The Rio de Flag watershed is running like a quarter mile from where I'm sitting. Before it gets here, it runs right through downtown Flagstaff, through all of the south side. It runs right past City Hall and comes into the community from the north and northwest. It's the impact of massive flooding and debris flows in a watershed like that, moving straight through an urban area, that is what will lead to extraordinary costs. And unfortunately, quite possibly loss of life, and certainly changes in people's way of life. Flagstaff is not unique in this. The town of Paradise, California, that was burned by severe fire is emblematic in many people's minds of some of these damages that can happen. But other communities, Ruidoso, New Mexico, experienced very severe fires through the urban area this past summer. Santa Fe, New Mexico has, much like the Rio de Flag, a ditch that runs through it. And these two so-called rivers, when people come from wetter places, they're like, there's not even any water in this. Why are you calling it a river? Well, yeah, usually there's not water in it, but when something happens in the upper watershed, then we are going to see massive flooding coming through those landscapes. They are also, just real quickly, they are the focus of projects to try to do things like what I was talking about of thinning trees and reintroducing fire. That's true in Santa Fe and here in Flagstaff, but we're probably not moving fast enough.
Trey, I believe you got your hand up for a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, and I appreciate you for the info and all that you presented, but I know you mentioned that logging is a bit of an issue, and I know I've seen separately that you mentioned them just kind of cutting down all of the trees, including the old growth trees, and then replanting. You have like all of these trees that are the same age, kind of adding to this problem of these young trees. Do you know if there are any initiatives statewide for there to be increased protections, or if there are any protections of the forest as it pertains to logging and their practices?
That's a really good question. And the initial economy of Flagstaff, Arizona was mostly based on the timber industry. And that's true for many mountain communities in the West. Back in the day, so to speak, the trees that were primarily cut were large and old trees. That we use the term old growth nowadays for that. Those days really ended quite a while ago. It's been about 30 years now since the last sawmill closed in this area. And those closures were for probably a couple of reasons. One being that we kind of ran out of, we had logged those old trees so extensively that there were few left. And then increased environmental protection of the remaining trees and habitats was also impeding the industry. In our case, there was not so much planting of young trees. It was largely natural regeneration. Then there was some planting too, but there was a lot of natural regeneration. It had the same effect as what you are saying, creating a dense forest of younger trees. And so this shift in forest structure led the forest to be more dense. The canopies are more connected, touching each other from tree to tree, and also having this ladder fuel situation where branches and small trees help carry fire up into the canopies of the larger trees. Today in our area, and I can say this for the Coconino National Forest and I think all the national forests in Arizona, there's essentially no cutting of old growth trees. But there is an emphasis on thinning of younger trees in order to try to restore a forest structure that's safer, more resilient to fire.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
So Joel, you put a question into the chat. Would you like to express your question? Joel, Joel put a question into the chat. How many billions does the US need for clean energy? Now that's a
Sorry.
yeah, Joel, go ahead.
Thank you. No, it's a question because a geopolitical Mr. Professor in Mexico, Alfredo Jalife, is a professor at university speaking about 3 billions, no, And I don't know what is the real reason in the United States. This is my personal question. Thank you.
So, Joel, I think you're asking about what would be necessary for clean energy to prevail in the U.S. Is that
Yeah.
okay? Um, I'm not an expert in that, and I don't know if Stefan is. Stefan, maybe you want to take that question?
Well, so I don't know really what the number is for the US at the moment, but back in 2017, a group out of Stanford University and from all over the world put together an estimate that if we used technologies we already have in hand for wind, solar, tidal, all the different kinds of renewable energy, clean energy, if we invested between 1.8 and 3.6 trillion dollars per year between then and 2050, we could get entirely away from fossil fuels without any need for them whatsoever. So we've got the technology in hand. If you look at the costs of climate damage now, we're talking about much, much larger sums. If we reach 1.5 degrees centigrade warming, and that's not just in this spot, it's the average global annual temperature. When we reach 1.5 degrees warming for the entire globe through an entire year, then we can expect $54 trillion per year in climate-related damages. So the 1.8 to $3.6 trillion investment per year pales in comparison to the costs that are coming down our throat. We are now projected to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade warming. That's global average annual temperature in sometime in the year 2028.
Jeez. At one time, that was the target for the end of the century.
And more recently, they've been saying 2040. Now it's very clear that as our emissions continue to rise rapidly, we're going to hit that in 2028.
Wow.
And those are IPCC numbers. Yeah. So I was talking about Mark Z. Jacobson at Stanford. They did a big publication in the engineering journal called Joule, Joule, and the title of their article is The Solutions Project. And within that, they did all these calculations of what would be needed. And they broke it down country by country in terms of what are the clean energy resources in each country and what would be needed to take advantage of those. So it's a very interesting report if anybody's interested in seeing that. Other questions for Dr. Fulé? So I guess I've got another question. So we're now seeing that particularly in places like Southern California, people can no longer get fire insurance. In places like Florida, people can no longer get storm insurance. I recently saw on a Nextdoor conversation that people are having a hard time getting fire insurance here in Flagstaff. So what can we expect there? Can we expect to not be covered by any kind of home insurance relative to these climate change effects in the near future?
Again, I'm not an expert on insurance per se, but the trends that we've been talking about, for instance, the increase in acreage and severity of fires across the Southwest, insurance company executives can read those kind of graphs just as well as all the rest of us, right? And so it does appear that around much of the country, those kinds of things are changing. There is an intermediate point though. I've read in news reports of really cataclysmic losses of insurance in the places you mentioned in California and Florida, where people are just like cut off. But something that might be a more positive trend and that we do see some evidence of in other places is where you can kind of get rewarded for good behavior around your home. So reducing fuels, making your house and your landscape less flammable can save, you can get credit or a lower rate of premiums, or perhaps keep insurance at a time when another person might be denied. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. And there are many programs. There's excellent information on a program called Firewise, just Firewise. If you look up firewise.org, that describes how to protect your home as best as possible from embers falling on it from a wildfire that tend to start fires right next to people's homes. It's very frequently the case that when when homes and structures do burn, it's not because a wall of flame moved through the whole neighborhood, but rather because the fire approaching is showering sparks on that landscape. And if you have vegetation or a wooden roof or a wooden deck or junipers growing right next to your house, junipers being a very flammable type of landscaping, then your house is more likely to burn.
Beverly Hedden, you've got your hand up. Go ahead, Beverly.
Yes, in relation to that, I have some friends in Superior, Arizona, which is about 60 miles east of Phoenix, and a whole slew of them had their fire insurance or their insurance canceled because of the close fires. So, and that's a pretty rapid response, because the fire didn't reach Superior, but it was like across the road a few years ago. So that's really a shame. They just cannot get insurance.
Yeah.
I think we'll be seeing that more and more around the world as we move forward. Really, the insurance agencies are in the business of assessing risk and cost. And so they have been some of the earliest to respond to climate change effects. It was the agricultural insurance agencies who were insuring crops and harvests and things like that, who changed their actuarial tables back in the 1970s. So they were one of the first businesses to respond to climate change effects. I don't know if you all know, but we write a monthly column called Spotlight on Climate. And there is a insurance CEO for an insurance group who is writing the next Spotlight. And this is going to be the topic of what she writes about. And I think it's going to be the Spotlight for this next month. So, and in her case, she's going to also mention that some of the insurance groups are starting to look at larger scale ways to spread risk and have ways for those people in communities where they can no longer get fire or flood insurance to provide them with some form of at least limited insurance. So the insurance agencies are working on a solution, but they don't have one in hand yet. Trey, another question.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I just recalled from a recent documentary I had seen about with rising temperatures, certain trees or species of trees moving further north than they had once previously been because of that climate change. Do you foresee that, being something that Arizona would experience in any significant way in the next, like over the course of this century, and how that, and if so, how that might impact the number of forest fires that we see?
Well, the short answer is yes. And the longer answer is it gets pretty complicated. So you can have movement of trees, but the trees, of course, can't walk or move anywhere. So for a tree to move means that its seeds would have to germinate in places that might be moister than where it currently is growing, and then it would have to survive, grow up, get big enough to produce its own seeds, and so on. So that's a pretty slow process. That's kind of a migration, a natural migration. Another complication for us is that, very broadly speaking, it gets colder as you move north, but the real climate gradients in the Southwest are elevational gradients rather than latitudinal gradients. So for example, if you leave the forest in Flagstaff and go north, you go down in elevation into drier conditions. So there's not a smooth habitat for species to be able to necessarily migrate northwards. What's probably more likely is that migration will occur uphill, so that species that might be currently found in the montane forest we were looking at might move higher into what's currently the subalpine forest. There's also the idea of assisted migration, and this would be where people, managers, conservationists, the Forest Service, whoever it might be, make decisions to try to plant or propagate species in places where they do not historically occur, because we have evidence that they may be able to survive in those places. And so that can greatly speed up this process of migration. However, there's a whole lot unknown about it. So it's certainly not a panacea. Just to give, there's too many examples to get into, but just to give one example of why you should not necessarily run out and start planting things uphill, we may have evidence from climate models that in 2060, a given place will be a good habitat for a certain species. But if we go plant it there today, it's not 2060 yet. So it may be still too cold for that, that species to survive. Or even if the habitat on average is okay, the extremes of cold, wet, warm, dry, whatever that site experiences may not be survivable. And we don't, because we would be through assisted migration doing something that moving species in a way that they have not moved in the entire history of civilization, let's say, 6,000, 8,000 years, something like that. We have no idea. We have no evidence for how it'll turn out. People are doing experiments like this right now, but it would be overly simplistic to think that moving species is necessarily going to be a solution. Just like another quite simplistic response to climate change is the idea of, let's just plant millions and millions of trees any place a tree can grow, because trees take up carbon. Yes, they do. They also can catch on fire and release that carbon, or die and release that carbon. So there's a lot of complexity in all these issues.
Right on. If I could real quick, David, in relation to that, let's say we compare a prescribed fire with a more catastrophic lightning-caused fire. What's the relative output of carbon from those two kinds of fires?
So say that part again. What's between which two kinds of fires?
So prescribed fires,
Mm.
which are more controlled and, usually the understory, versus wildfires, which
Versus
may be
severe.
lightning caused or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And some of the things we call wildfires, by the way, do have very beneficial effects, but high severity wildfires burning in ecosystems that are not adapted to that do in fact result in enormous releases of carbon. So the differences are orders of magnitude. So that would be like 10, 100, 1,000 times more carbon released. And the carbon comes not only from the vegetation, but remember that picture of the flood? And we were looking at the flood and it was like real all black. It didn't look like water. It looked like tar coming down the hillside. That's because it's carrying a huge amount of soil, and it's carrying the organic material, which is carbon-based compounds that are stored in that soil. And when the soil moves, and ends up being deposited somewhere else. That carbon gets released, and the productivity that was so hard won high up in the watershed, the process of soil formation over thousands and millions of years, geologic time, can be washed down in an afternoon and completely change that environment. So yeah, it's a huge difference. David, thanks for being patient.
Thanks for taking my question. We've been fortunate here in northern Arizona not to have massive bark beetle infestations and massive tree die-offs. But I'm told up in Colorado and other western states that entire forests have been killed. The trees are standing, but killed by bark beetles. How should those dead standing forests be managed to reduce the risk of fire just engulfing the dead trees?
Those are good questions too. And so I'm a professor, and I'm always going to say it's complicated and try to give a complicated answer. And it is complicated. To address the question of what to do with dead trees, it's sort of a trade-off, because on the one hand, if you were to enter the area, whether it's been burned or whether the trees have been killed by bark beetles, and cut down and remove that wood, haul off logs and so on, that is one type of stress on the environment. So it involves opening roads or creating roads. If it's a burned area, the soils are very vulnerable. So erosion from those activities makes things a lot worse. On the other hand, in some cases, especially in forests that were pretty dense, leaving those big trees there means that they're going to start falling on each other. And eventually it is likely, it's not a certainty, but it's likely that a pretty severe fire will occur because of those heavy fuels. And that fire will be a second blow to the recovery of that ecosystem. There will be young trees trying to grow up between these fallen trees, and they can be burned up. So balancing that out is kind of a case-by-case question, I would say. Also, I wanted to comment real quick on our situation with respect to pathogens of trees. And we are in an unusual situation with respect to bark beetles in particular. So these are tiny little beetles, multiple species, that burrow under the bark of a tree. They mate, lay their eggs, and then their larvae, as they grow, eat the phloem of the tree and its cambium. These are the tissues under the bark that are alive and that make the tree grow. So if the beetle larvae grow all around the tree, they cut off the flow of sugar from the leaves to the roots, and the tree dies. We have an environment that's pretty stressful in terms of hot, dry conditions. We have many forests that are very crowded, kind of as illustrated by that data from Arizona that showed how many young trees per acre we have. But yet the Southwest has not seen very large bark beetle outbreaks. And my understanding from colleagues who are forest entomologists is that it's not really clear why that is. It may be that we are lucky, or it may be that we just don't fully understand the way in which trees can adapt. Because similar densities of trees in places farther north, like in South Dakota and the Black Hills, lead to landscape scale bark beetle outbreaks.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, any other questions for Dr. Fulé? We still have him, so there's the chances are dwindling. Ask your questions now.
Here.
Joel.
Doctor, United Nations says about it's possible this century is restoration. What do you think about this?
The United Nations has designated this decade as a decade of ecological restoration, and the UN has been very good at organizing the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That panel exists under a UN convention. It's funny how many nations, on the one hand, can do very irrational things or have wars and say all kinds of counterproductive things, but then can also work together sometimes through the institution of the UN. And I would say that the idea of trying to intervene in restoration, which is really aimed at restoring the natural properties of ecosystems that support all life on Earth, is a great idea. And by recognizing the effects of this steady warming of climate that is going to happen, much of it is going to happen even if we can transition well to renewable energy and so on. And if we don't transition well, it'll be that much worse. So intervening now makes sense. It would be a mistake to wait several decades and then have a decade of restoration. You would have lost a tremendous amount in between. All that being said, I think that many of these kinds of initiatives are more something to aspire to than something that is actually supported with a lot of money and resources. It sounds good to say it, but it doesn't necessarily change policies that are taking place all around the world.
All right. Well, Dr. Fulé, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with everybody. You all know that these are recorded, and so they will come, if this will become part of the library of climate presentations known as Climate Talks for Everyone, and those are located on the NASCA.org website. So please take a look through the topics, pick the ones that are of greatest interest to you, and please do look at them. There are a lot of great presentations in the series. Again, thank you, Dr. Fulé.
Thanks, Stefan. Thanks to all of you who joined as well. I appreciate it. It was a pleasure to talk with all of you.